Today's presentation is titled Measuring the Economic Impact of Non-Motorized Transportation, and we will be hearing from Erica Simmons with the Volpe Transportation Systems Center, Sean Quinn from New York City Department of Transportation, Greg Lindsley with the University of Minnesota, and my name is James Gallagher. I'm the PBIC Communications Manager. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. First, I'd like to apologize for any background noise you might hear. There's a bit of construction going on outside my office that I do not have control over. And I'd like to welcome Erica, Sean, and Greg. Erica, do we have you on the line?
Yep, I'm here.
And Sean and Greg, are you there as well?
Yep.
Yes, we are. I am. This is Greg.
All right. Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear both our presenters, please click the hand icon in the upper right corner of your screen. This lets me know that you can hear us properly. All right, I'm seeing lots of hands raised. Before we get started, I want to run over a few administrative details about the functionality of the webinar and our software. If for any reason you get locked out, just go ahead and log back in. You should be able to join the webinar in session. I will be posting the presentation slides and a recording of today's webinar to our website, pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, later this week or next, and you'll be able to catch up on anything you might have missed. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. There are a lot of people on this call, and by muting your audio, it helps us cut down on confusion and background noise. Still, you may ask questions or report issues through the question box in your webinar control panel. Please feel free to ask questions at any time in the presentation, and we will hold about 20 minutes in the back end of the presentation for a Q&A session. Within a couple of days, you will receive an email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center that will include instructions for a certificate to get your CM credits. This webinar has been submitted to AICP and may be approved for 1.5 CM credits. So be sure to be on the lookout for that email. Most PBIC webinars are approved for CM credits. You can learn more about PBIC webinars or check out past webinars again at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. We also post frequent updates about our webinars and others on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/pedbike, and you can join our mail list at pedbikeinfo.org/signup. I promise we won't spam you. Before we start the feature presentation, I want to take a quick poll from the audience. First, let us know how many participants are at your site. Give it a few more seconds. All right, thank you. And also, please tell us a little bit more about your background. Give it about 5 more seconds. All right, thank you very much. Now let's get to our presentations. Erica, please take it from here.
All right, great, thank you. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you for all for joining today. So just a bit of background on this particular white paper. This is the Evaluating the Economic Benefits of Non-Motorized Transportation white paper, which the U.S. Department of Transportation's Volpe Center, which is where I am, wrote for the sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration as part of the non-motorized transportation pilot program as we were wrapping that project up. This report was part of a larger team effort that involved Bill Lyons, Amy Ingalls, Michael Kay, Monisha Khurana, and Marguerite Solmont, as well as myself. And just a bit of background on the NTCP project. The Non-Motorized Transportation Pilot Program, or NTPP, was a program under Safety Lou, which provided $28 million each for 4 communities: Columbia, Missouri; Marin County, California; Minneapolis, Minnesota; and Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, with the intention of using these pilot communities to understand what can be accomplished with that level of investment into pedestrian and bicycle programs and projects. This project involved a requirement for the Federal Highway Administration and the 4 pilot communities to evaluate the impacts of their investments, which led to a larger working group effort facilitated by the Volpe Center, where we worked to collect the data throughout the project and analyze a suite of different types of impacts from the NTPP. And those larger impacts, which are analyzed in a 2012 report to Congress and the 2014 final report, involved mode share shifts, project level evaluations, access and mobility, environment and energy, safety, and public health impacts. So while we were working on the NTPP project, there was a desire to evaluate the economic benefits from the program, but limited data to do that, and perceived need among the working group for more practical and available methodologies. And so the goal of this white paper was to provide a resource both for those communities and for communities in general who are interested in measuring the economic impacts from non-motorized investments to understand what is out there in terms of economic impact analysis and what can be done practically by these communities. So this white paper goes through, was organized in terms of different types of economic benefits. What are you looking for? What are the methods that you can use to analyze them? What are the scales of analysis that make sense? Should you be looking at a particular street or at an entire county? And then conclusion and recommendations for these communities. And apparently that slide is right. Okay, so user cost savings is the first, So the types of economic benefits from non-motorized transportation that we broke out involve user cost savings, direct impacts from these investments, more indirect impacts or induced impacts, and these come in the form of changes in consumer behavior as a result of these investments, economic impacts due to health savings, and economic impacts due to environmental benefits. So when it came to user cost savings, what we're talking about is what the lower user costs and increased affordability of travel for bicyclists and pedestrians, with the idea that this can allow people to access jobs, opportunities, shopping areas, just get around their communities in a way that costs less money, which provides them more money to spend on other things. The methods for measurement for this would include user surveys of traveler behavior and the costs associated with their travel, and then generalizing it by looking at larger scale mode share analyses. For direct economic benefits, this refers more to the money spent directly as a result of new non-motorized infrastructure programs. This would include construction jobs, it would include bike store revenue, tour companies, and other businesses that directly relate to the infrastructure or programs developed. And the methods for measurement here would include business surveys or tax receipts for these particular businesses that are directly related to the infrastructure or programs. Indirect or induced economic benefits includes economic activity more indirectly caused by changes in transportation modes or streetscape characteristics as a result of pedestrian or bicycle infrastructure. We've thought of this in terms of a couple potential reasons, one being as a result of the user cost savings that travelers would benefit from if they have more money, less money that they're spending on transportation, They have the ability to spend more of it on other things. And it's, of course, important to recognize that these are not, that all of the benefits that I'm talking about are not necessarily additive. You cannot come up with a list of all of these and then sum them and say that this is your total benefits. Obviously, this is another way of looking at user cost savings, is that they can spend it on something else. Bicycle and pedestrian travel can be more conducive to browsing. If you're on a shopping street where you can walk as opposed to drive, you can walk into more businesses, and you can more casually explore an area. And then the idea that street redesigns may make commercial streets more attractive to visitors and may make visitors feel more safe, and can have benefits for businesses along that street as a result. So methods for measuring these benefits could include consumer surveys, for instance, by mode share and consumer behavior, and also looking at sales tax receipts, commercial vacancy rates, rents, and other economic indicators for a shopping quarter as a whole. For economic impacts due to health savings, we thought of this both in terms of what are the savings from reduced mortality or morbidity, illness due to obesity, but also economic savings from reduced mortality or injury due to safety improvements. And then the methods for measurement listed below are actually both focused more on the obesity and increased active transportation. So the World Health Organization's Healthy Economic Assessment Tool, or HEAT, basically estimates the reduced cost of mortality due to bicycle infrastructure. In Europe, the model can actually be used for both bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure and looks at mortality and morbidity. In the United States, it has been, at this point, adapted to estimate mortality but not morbidity for bicycle infrastructure. And then the Integrated Transport and Health Impacts Model, or ITHIM, which was initially developed in the UK, is now being used on a pilot in California by the California Department of Public Health to analyze, or to try to analyze the and quantify the health co-benefits from non-motorized transportation infrastructure. And both of these tools, as I've mentioned, are currently in development, and this is definitely an evolving field in terms of this topic. And then we listed economic impacts due to environmental benefits. These could include health benefits from air quality improvements, visual air quality, and greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We did not go into analysis methods for this in a lot of detail in the white paper, but noted that these are often diffuse and difficult to measure at a local scale, but that they are still, when you're talking about overall economic impacts from non-motorized transportation, they are in the mix. So in terms of measures of cumulative economic impact, so each of the types of economic impacts that I just went through are basically different aspects of the picture. But if you're looking at what are the cumulative economic benefits for an area, for a region, for a city, there are a number of models and tools that the white paper analyzes, including large-scale input-output models like REMI and Implan and TREDIS, and then the UK Department for Transportation's guidance on the appraisal and walking and cycling schemes. Some of these tools are cost-benefit analysis tools, while others are post-project evaluation tools. And with all of these, when you're using them, you need to document your assumptions very carefully so that you actually understand, in the end, what it is that you're measuring. So additional considerations with all of these is the need for good baseline data. Ideally, these analyses should have pre-project data so that you can do a pre- and post-project comparison. This is not always possible, but this is the ideal. And a best practice is to design your evaluation strategy before project implementation so that you can have this pre-data before the project is done. And then a control study. You need a control to help understand the counterfactual, what would have happened without the project, and are the changes that I have measured actually because of the project or because of something else entirely. And best practices for this involve using a location with similar characteristics, or if you can compare a smaller location to the average for the larger region that it's a part of. So in terms of scales of observation and analysis, we looked at the micro scale. These involve individual businesses or consumers. The mesoscale, basically this intermediate group of neighborhood and commercial corridor studies. And then macro scale studies at the city, zip code, county, or state level. So for micro scale studies, they have a number of advantages, mainly that data collection is relatively simple and concrete. And you can use it especially for studying cost savings and consumer behavior for individual consumers. The challenges are that it's difficult to extrapolate to more general conclusions. If you interview a sample of shoppers on one street, what can you say at a larger scale about that, and what assumptions are you making in making larger generalizations? A few examples of these studies. One of them is the University of Minneapolis' study of consumer behavior of bike share users, which you'll be hearing more about today. And then another one is in Toronto, a study of the consumer behavior of shoppers by mode. So they interviewed people who arrived there by car, by transit, walking, and bicycling to look at how their spending habits differed, and found in that case that bikers and walkers were spending more in the shopping district than people who arrived there by car or transit. That was actually a study just of a pre-project state. It was not a post-project study, but that goes back to the importance of having that pre-project data so that you can look at how things change after a project happens. At the mesoscale, looking at neighborhoods or corridors, there are a number of advantages. One is that it's a fine-grained enough scale to measure impacts from small infrastructure projects. If you try to measure the impact of a bike lane at the county scale, you probably won't find it. But if you look at the shopping corridor that the bike lane is in, you may have better results. And they also don't require as much extrapolation as microscale analysis. But challenges can be just data availability. Do you have the data on that shopping corridor to understand how the economic health of that corridor changed? And then an example study here, which you'll be hearing about a similar study from the New York City Department of Transportation, but we looked at the Measuring the Street study from 2012, which was looking to evaluate the impacts of these individual projects on adjacent corridors. So looking in this medium scale, they analyzed commercial indicators like city tax sales receipts, commercial vacancy rates, and other economic measures, and then they surveyed visitors and observed sites and collected before and after data, which they compared for these areas to either similar streets or to borough averages to be able to say, or to be able to analyze how these projects affected the commercial corridors that they're a part of. And a few examples of results that they came up with In one case, they found a 49% increase in retail sales on or near projected bike lanes compared to a 3% increase borough-wide for a particular project, and similar results in a few other locations. For macro-scale studies, looking at the city, county, zip code, or state level, the advantages would be to understand the cumulative impacts at a larger scale, and also to, in some sense, account for economic displacement rather than economic generation. Was new economic value created, or did the bike shop move from one street to the next street over because now there's a bike lane there? But the challenges, once again, include data availability. The scale of analysis may be too coarse-grained to account for small and localized impacts. You just may not see the impacts of these small projects. And the economic models can be costly and complex and often difficult to use. An example study for this type of study is the Vermont Agency of Transportation, which did a report in 2012 called The Economic Impact of Bicycling and Walking in Vermont. And they found their goal was to evaluate the impact statewide of bicycling and walking. And it was prompted by the Vermont Pedestrian and Bicycle Policy Plan development that there was a perceived need to understand at a statewide level what bicycling and walking brings to their economy. So they used REMI, Regional Economic Model, as well as data from running and cycling events. What is the running and cycling tourist industry bringing to the state, and then business surveys as well. In addition, they had wanted to look at some of these other benefits we've talked about, like avoided societal costs related to mode shifts to automobile travel, or from automobile travel to bicycling and walking, but found that data difficult to obtain and analyze at the state level. But so conclusions that we came up with in our white paper, and general recommendations for communities looking to do this kind of analysis. The first one was just determining the goals of your analysis, to understand what types of economic impacts are you really interested in understanding, and what methods will or can you use, and what data do you have. And then thinking about the scale issue. Is this more appropriate to study at the level of individual consumers, of neighborhoods, or cities or states? And then to determine what you can do in terms of the cost and complexity of the analysis and the time frame that you have, whether you can get baseline data, and whether you can have a control location for your study. And just the general advice to, if possible, plan the evaluation before you begin your project so that you can begin to collect baseline data and establish controls and have consistent data for your analysis. And so that's the overview of the paper. Acknowledgements, this work was sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration. We were working closely with the 4 NTPP pilot communities, as well as the Rails to Trails Conservancy, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Marin County Bicycle Coalition, and then thanking specifically New York City DOT and VTrans for speaking with us about their research methods. So that is all I have to share today.
All right, now we're going to hear from Sean Quinn.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Thanks for having me here today. I am going to talk about a process that we went through at DOT a couple years ago to sort of make the business case for a high-quality public realm. Basically, we were looking for an economic way to study and analyze the benefits of our various projects throughout the city. I'll walk through that process and then give you all links at the end to the actual document, which includes a lot more information than I'm going to talk about here. I'm currently the co-director of DOT's Pedestrian Projects Group, and I worked on a team with other people within our agency, many of who have moved on at this point. But we also worked in partnership with the Department of Finance in the city, as well as an economic consulting firm that helped us develop a lot of our strategies. Also, Erica did allude a little bit to our study in the Measuring the Streets report. We had put in a couple of facts and figures that came out of this larger study that I'm going to discuss here today. So over time, the design goals of the agency evolved from mobility and the automobile and safety to include other types of goals: access and mobility, public health, economic development, environmental quality, and livability and quality of life. So in reaching those goals, we had to evolve our metrics as well. We needed to figure out how to measure if we were reaching those goals, and what was the best way to measure success for each of our projects. We wanted to look at not just mobility and safety, but access. Oh, sorry, yes, I already said that. And these are the different tools that we had in-house to already look at those metrics. Standard things like collecting volumes and vehicle LOS, crashes and safety numbers from our police department, looking at different types of users in the area, looking at how we were impacting air quality and the environment, and then just user satisfaction of these sites. But we didn't really have a great way to measure the business impact for each of our projects. We do 50 to 75 projects in-house every year around the city that range from small, very isolated intersection projects to very large corridor transportation projects that include road diets or transit enhancements, major intersection redesigns. So we needed to come up with a tool to see how they were impacting the city, as well as a way to help sell the projects to future neighborhoods as we were going out to do more projects in the future. So we came up with a list of potential ways to measure this economic impact. We started with qualitative ideas, which would be more surrounding surveys, which we had actually done in the past to some success, to quantitative, looking at retail activity, rents, property values, property sales, and then job creation and business creation. We went and weighed each of the pros and cons of all of those different types of measures, looking at surveys of businesses or shoppers. There's a lot of pros because it's from the horse's mouth, and you get the insights of people who are on the ground there every day. Cons are that it could be very difficult to formulate a survey that's not biased in any way, or to select your sample of participants in the survey. It's less authoritative than quantitative data for sure. And it is labor intensive. It takes a large staff to get the questions answered by a representative group of people in the field. We looked at the retail sales, collecting retail sales information via sales tax. This had a lot of benefits that we could see. It was a strong direct indicator of business health. And it had a few cons, specifically that because of confidentiality, our data sets might be limited. Looking at retail sales via survey, it's the same as above for the pros, but again, the data accuracy can't be verified. There might be some self-selection in the responses, and it would be labor-intensive. And then of these other quantitative measures, we found a couple of cons that were sometimes insurmountable. For example, the commercial rent and vacancy data was limited in availability when we looked for that in New York City. Often it was only available through third-party firms that we had to purchase expensive memberships or to get access to that data. And then there was various cons to each of these other quantitative measures. So in the end, we decided and settled on looking at the retail sales via sales taxes. And I'll talk more about why and then how we got access to that data as well. So overall, like I mentioned, our research question that got us to this point was how have street improvements affected in economic activity at specific improvement sites. And here's one of our case studies is at Madison Square, which is in Midtown Manhattan, a project that we had completed in 2008. You could see right off, just looking at the photos, that there's many benefits to this project. Many benefits not just for safety and the community, but it enhances the streetscape. It changes it from an asphalt and infrastructure sort of wasteland into this place that has a lot more life and activity. So while that's very easy to say qualitatively, we needed to dig a little bit deeper to see how it was actually impacting the area. So we wanted to create a methodology that met 3 criteria. We wanted to use impartial data that was a direct measure of economic activity, data that would account for before and after changes, which in the span of a project's life, it occurs very quickly. And then we wanted to be able to measure impact in a small geographic area. So sales tax data was fairly easy to get and very easy to get a good amount of. All the businesses that we're interested in pay sales tax to the state. They're made every quarter, so we can look quarterly on a more granular level. The data was available to us with very little time lag. The tax records were very highly localized by address, so we could really dig into a project site. And then filing businesses classify themselves into specific industries, allowing us to filter by business type, which became important as we realized as we went on. So like I said, we were able to work with our Department of Finance, which received their data from the Department of Taxation and Finance. The Department of Finance, once it gets the data, it aggregated it into a way that ensured taxpayer confidentiality. So all the data that DOT received was stripped of any identifying information, and it was the basic data that we needed to do our study. We looked at 2 types of projects in our study, corridors and plazas. Corridors could be anything, like I said before, to road diets or transit service, widened sidewalks for a long distance. And we looked at a couple of plaza locations that were more localized to a specific neighborhood. For the corridors, we selected all tax lots that abutted the improvement along the corridor. And then for the plazas, that wasn't necessarily possible because the number of businesses on these spaces was limited. So we decided to do a radius of 200 to 350 feet from the improvement site. Any business within that radius was included in our study so that we can get a good sample size of data. And it's reasonable to think that businesses within that distance of the plaza were seeing an impact from that improvement. For each site, we chose several comparison sites. So here for 9th Avenue, we were able to choose the comparison sites on a staff level with just knowing the city. We didn't necessarily use the Department of Finance data to choose those comparison sites. We were thinking of similar corridors from being in and around the neighborhoods and being in and around the city with a similar mix of retail. So for 9th Avenue, we chose 10th Avenue just to the west and 7th Avenue just to the east, as well as Hudson Street to the south. These corridors had similar makeup of retail as 9th Avenue, and they were not set, and they did not receive upgrades to their street network as 9th Avenue did. For each improvement or comparison site, we obtained before and after data of our specified tax lots based on quarterly sales tax records from the Department of Finance. So it was either that 250 to 350 radius or along the entire corridor. And we chose to take 1 year pre-improvement data. So on 9th Avenue, we installed a parking protected bike lane along with pedestrian islands and street trees. So 1 year before that went in, we took the sales tax data, and then we chose to do 3 years of post-improvement data. After the study was completed, we determined, and we did some subsequent studies, we determined that 2 years after was actually sufficient going forward. And then we broke the data down into 2 industry sectors: retail, trade, and accommodation and food services. In going through the data, we had to do a lot of querying and filtering to get the actual businesses that we were looking for. So that included figuring out a way to isolate ground floor businesses versus businesses that may have been on other levels of the building. We did some manual checks of locations using Street View or going out to the site. We expanded site boundaries as needed to ensure sufficient data over all quarters. We did some smoothing to take care of outlier data spikes by averaging adjacent quarters, and we adjusted for inflation. So we compared the sales tax at each site in the year prior to implementation to sales 1, 2, and 3 years out, and compared each site with the comparison, which I already spoke about, as well as borough-wide sales at the same time frame. So the 9th Avenue project we compared against Manhattan. Here we're showing a Vanderbilt Avenue project, which we compared against the borough that it was in Brooklyn. And I have several case studies to talk through, but like I said, the final report will have many more case studies that I'm going to go through today. I just wanted to show you a corridor project and a plaza project. So on Vanderbilt Avenue in Brooklyn, we added a dedicated bike lane, median islands at all crossings that had trees and landscaping. We updated curbside regulations to ensure that loading was easily accessible in the off-peak shopping hours. And we were trying to solve the problem of sort of excess capacity and speeding on the corridor and to improve a key bicycle connection. We chose the neighboring corridors of Flatbush Avenue, 7th Avenue, and Washington Avenue as comparison sites. And you could see here the before and after photos of the project. So before it was wide open, 2 lanes in each direction, no bike facility, and in the after we had a standard bike lane, 4-to-3 lane conversion with turn lanes and new street trees and pedestrian safety improvements. And looking at the results, Vanderbilt Avenue did see significant improvement over the borough as well as many of the comparison sites. So it's a 102% growth in sales, which compared to 64% average for the comparison sites and 18% for a borough as a whole. The other thing we looked at in this report was other things that came out of it. One thing that the agency does in talking about all of our projects is we try to talk about three metrics: safety, mobility, and economic vitality, quality of life. So the economic vitality, the economic data is just one part of it. We saw injury crashes down significantly versus pre-traffic calming, and we also saw a bike ridership up by almost 80%, which is speaks to various things: a changing neighborhood, a better bike connection gets people out on the streets, and hopefully some mode shifting for local trips in the neighborhood. And then we chose this. Some of the other plaza sites we chose, or project sites we chose, are more sort of regional in scale. For example, the Bronx Hub is a very large community or area in the Bronx that people travel to from all over the borough to shop in. Or Madison Square in Midtown Manhattan is a major hub for people from not just the city, but tourists alike. So we wanted to choose this one location, St. Nicholas Avenue and Amsterdam Avenue in Manhattan, which is a very localized hub for, it really serves just the community that's there. We wanted to see how the improvements help the neighborhood at this very localized scale. It's a lower income neighborhood, small scale neighborhood retail. It was a very skewed and complex intersection with several transit connections. So we went in and made some changes to the street directions, created new public space out of underutilized roadbed. We improved the parking and loading in the area and improved an existing bike lane. So you can see the before had a multiple leg intersection with an expansive asphalt. Not very inviting, difficult to cross, and in the after we tightened up that intersection and added bicycle facilities, street trees, a new pedestrian plaza, and then we chose this comparison site to other areas just outside of the district on Amsterdam Avenue to make sure that we were really studying this localized improvement, and then one avenue over on Broadway. And we did get to see some good changes here. St. Nick in Amsterdam, the intersection, had a 48% growth in sales compared to 7% for the comparison sites and 39% for the borough as a whole. On top of that, we saw a 4% decrease in crashes, 47% decrease in injury crashes. Injuries were down, and pet injuries were way down. So all these things together add up to a successful project, a place that people are clearly wanting to come to, they feel safer going to. It's getting people out walking, getting people out biking. It's making these connections from the community that might not have been there before. It's really having a direct impact on how a neighborhood is growing. So overall, we have a couple of conclusions. We now know it's possible to document impacts of changes to the street environment on surrounding locally based retail business in a rigorous way. It does not mean that all projects will show an economic benefit. Luckily, most of the, I would say, all of the ones that we studied did. Urban economies are complex, and designing are complex, and designing streets involves trade-offs between different goals. So having those comparison sites was a good way to control other things that were going on in the city at the time. Quantitative data on retail sales would pair well with qualitative surveys of shoppers to create an even stronger causal explanation for changes in the behavior. Being able to demonstrate the potential economic benefit of a better designed street can be a powerful tool for evaluation of projects, addressing concerns of local residents and business owners. One case study that we have in the report is a project in the Bronx where we added a bus rapid transit route, which required the removal of a lot of parking to do so. So we wanted to study that one to see how the removal of parking impacted business along the corridor, and we actually saw very positive results, and results that we often quote now when we're going to other neighborhoods to talk about installing transit projects in their neighborhood. It also is a tool for activating business community in support of appropriately designed projects. It allows cities to link street design with economic development, similar to public health and active design. Based on New York City's results, safer, more inviting, and sustainable streets are rarely detrimental, and in the great majority of cases can be a boon to local business. And by playing a part in spurring reinvestment and capturing more spending within immediate neighborhoods, their benefits apply just as much to lower income neighborhoods with struggling retail as to affluent neighborhoods. So this is the report. It was released in December 2013. The link is here, and it'll be available to you later on. And like I said, this report has a very detailed step-by-step analysis of how to do this, if it wants to be replicated, why. It talks about things that we didn't end up going with, things that we chose to go with, why we did it, how we did it, and then a really robust set of results. So I would definitely recommend people checking this out. And that's it for me.
Great. Now we will hear from Greg Lindsay.
So let me open this up. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about one of the case studies that Erica mentioned earlier. We call it Sharing to Grow. And this was a study undertaken by a team of graduate students here who proposed a project to Bikes Belong Foundation. The students are Jessie Shono, Shiza Wang, and Andrew Harrison. Jessie's now getting her PhD here. Shiza is working on his PhD at USC, and Andrew Harrison is with a consulting firm here, SRF. We're interested, this case study looked at economic activity associated with Nice Ride bike share stations. And this was undertaken back in 2012. So most of you, we imagine, are familiar with bike sharing, but the Minneapolis model is this. It's really a bike rental system. It's a pricing model here in Minneapolis, encourages short one-way trips. When the study was undertaken, there were about 116 stations throughout the cities, mainly in Minneapolis. That system has expanded now. The bikes are available 24 hours a day. In Minneapolis, for a number of reasons, St. Paul, they're taken away in the winter, largely because of the high levels of snow and ice and the salt on the roads that could affect those. The management strategy that Nice Ride Minnesota has used has involved a short and long-term subscriptions that go to both day users and annual subscribers, as well as people can not subscribe at all and use. This is the question we were interested in trying to address. Do bike share stations generate local economic activity? And the conceptual model the students developed had really three components. The notion was that we'll place a bike share station, and that what that does, effectively from a travel perspective, it differentially increase the accessibility that people have to neighborhoods near the stations. And if that's the case, if there's differential accessibility, then people may make different travel behavior decisions. They may change decisions, or they may take additional trips. And if they're making additional trips, they may make additional expenditures. People may spend money at the places they decide to go to the newly accessible stations. So what we wanted to do was design elements of a study that would look at factors associated with station use, that would look at people's behavior in terms of destinations, and would look at people's behavior in terms of expenditure patterns. And a lot of the things, for example, that Sean spoke about were considered in the methodology. For example, the nature of qualitative versus quantitative data, its reliability and validity, and how it's received by audiences. You'll see how we address some of those issues in this study. I've got a couple maps here to illustrate this notion of how stations increase accessibility. In this particular case, you see a subset of the stations in Minneapolis, and the green one is a small cafe in a residential neighborhood called Birchwood Cafe. And what Jesse mapped there was a 15-minute walking time, assuming a person's walking 3 miles an hour. And you can see that there's an access zone that would include one Nice Ride station. If we think about what people can do by using bike share in combination with walking, we can see how accessibility to a particular place changes. This map illustrates the neighborhoods within Minneapolis that are accessible to Birchwood Cafe within 30 minutes if you look at a combination of walking to a Nice Ride station and then bicycling over to Birchwood at 10 miles an hour. So we see it's fairly straightforward to show with this type of analysis how the placement of bike share stations potentially increases accessibility to businesses in the community by giving people a differential way to travel, at least relative to walking. Here, Jesse did the same thing for a station that is with a 30-minute travel time buffer, and you look at how that changes accessibility. And so one thing I think to think about in the context of assessing bike share programs is that they do, relative to walking, have the potential to greatly expand accessibility to various businesses. And if more people are accessible, that's a measure of potential demand. That can be quantified. So our measurement approach, we wanted to look at stations, we wanted to look at the stations and the surrounding land use, and we wanted to look at what factors affected the total number of trips in and out of those particular stations. We wanted to look then at what business owners near those stations thought about those stations. And we wanted to get a measure of whether or not when people were traveling and using Nice Ride, they were spending any money. And so we're going to use 3 different types of approaches. We're going to use a GIS modeling exercise where we create a facility demand model. We're going to do a survey of subscribers, and we're going to do qualitative interviews with business owners. And so we're more on the soft side, if you will, compared to the work that Sean just described. So one of the first things we did, and this is both in the report and it's a paper that's come out in the Journal of Urban Planning and Development, we're going to look at station demand models. And our unit of analysis here is we've defined a station area as a quarter-mile walking distance buffer, and we then are drawing information for the census blocks that intersect with that. Our dependent variable is the total number of trips into and out of each station. And for that year, as I noted, there were about 116 stations. I think over the course of the year, there were upwards of 200,000 trips in the Nice Ride network for that year. So that's the database that we're analyzing here. And in particular, we wanted to look at does the count of nearby businesses affect the number of trips into and out of the stations? In other words, is there a correlation between the number of people that use a station and the number of places that they can patronize in terms of retail operations or food-related businesses? We also are interested in whether or not accessibility to jobs affects the likelihood that a station is used. So we have some basic descriptive statistics for the bike share station here in Minneapolis at that time. The mean number of trips in and out of a station per day was 19.5, though one approached 100. The total number of trips you can see there on the screen. The average was about 3,750 for total trips, and Trip origins and destinations on average across the facilities were comparable, but when you think about the trips themselves, there is some imbalancing that goes on because of the way that people use these for various purposes. So our facility demand model had a number of variables. We wanted to look at measures of economic activity. For example, how many food-related stores are adjacent to a station within that buffer zone. So we did counts of those by inventorying stores from various databases. We looked at food-related stores are defined as grocery stores, cafes, restaurants, bars, places where you could either sit down and have a meal or take food out. We also had a measure of accessibility to jobs by transit within 30 minutes. This variable was created to try to get at whether or not people might be using the Nice Ride stations in conjunction with a commute to work. Now, the other variables come from looking at facility demand models that people have published elsewhere. We wanted to look at built environment variables. We know that people use Nice Ride bike share stations for recreation, so we wanted to look at proximity to water. For example, Minneapolis is the city of lakes. There are bike share stations at lakes that are used for recreational activity. Downtown Minneapolis is bordered by the Mississippi River. So we looked at measure to water. We wanted to look at proximity to the central business district. We wanted to look at distance to parks. We wanted to look at whether or not a bike share station was on the campus of University of Minnesota. We wanted to control for socio-demographic variables. We wanted to look at whether or not, for example, a station was located at a Class 1 bike facility or a multi-use trail access point. We wanted to look at accessibility to other bike share stations, so we constructed a distance access variable for it. And then we looked at several operational controls given the particulars of the system that have been put in place here. Initially, when the bike share station was open, there were no stations in a lower income portion of the city up in North Minneapolis. There were some stations that were adversely affected by construction of a light rail system during the years we were analyzing, and there were stations that came online during 2011, so we had to control for the number of days that stations were open. When we estimate this model, it's a regression model, a statistical model, and we take as our dependent variable the number of trips into and out of the station. We can explain about 85% of the variation. And each of those variables that's on this slide had a statistically significant correlation with the number of trips in and out. So you can start to see what sort of activities. And in fact, the two variables that we were interested in, is there more activity at bike share station nearby food-related stores, and does the number of jobs that are accessible by transit interact positively with bike share stations? Those were all significant. So this model was helpful for a variety of reasons. One, it illustrates those factors that are associated with bike share usage, and then second, it underscores that in this particular case, there's a correlation which we'd interpret as not causal because it's cross-sectional analysis, but there's correlation with different types of economic activity as well as recreational and other activity that matters. So this is part of the analysis that we did. To complement this, we wanted to look at whether or not businesses, what their perception is of having a Nice Ride bike share station near their place of business. And so we stratified businesses by type. We also looked at two broader categories. We looked at businesses that have established some type of Nice Ride relationship. In other words, they were sponsoring a kiosk, a bike rental kiosk, or they had initiated some type of a rewards program or issued coupons for use of Nice Ride. And then the others, we looked at businesses within station areas, and we looked at various geographic factors as well as type of business. We identified about 29 businesses, and each of the businesses was visited, held a half-hour conversation, hour-long conversation with the business owner or the business manager, and there are basic 4 questions. These are qualitative interviews. open-ended, and they let the business managers speak. They ask them about, do they notice nice riders or traditional bicyclists? Are they using any particular strategies to attract bike share users? If so, what are they? Do they offer subscriptions? In other words, have they encouraged or subsidized their employees of use of bike share to facilitate that? And would they give up parking space or sidewalk space to get a nice ride station by their business? So what we'll do now is we'll summarize these general, the general thrust of the responses to these questions. First question, do the business owners notice nice riders or bicyclists patronizing their business? And the short answer is not really. They didn't see this. And the reasons were this, that it was hard to distinguish nice riders from other cyclists or customers arriving on foot. Many of the nice riders don't ride helmets. And so by the time they get in the store, people were not, the owners or managers weren't identifying the bike share users from others. They did, for those who said they noticed it, the proximity to the nice ride station was a major factor. In other words, the closer the station, the more likely they were to attribute some of their business, the patronage of their business, to the presence of the bike share. They felt that they were they could more easily identify regular bicyclists because they bring a helmet or they park out front. And those that had offered nice ride coupons reported mixed results, not heavy use of those coupons. And so in this case, the business owners didn't have strong endorsements of the program overall in terms of business usage. Well, there are other findings, though, that in one sense offset that in a second. Some, as we noted, are using deals and discounts to attract nice riders. These coupons for a particular transaction or a rewards program. More importantly, some were advertising on nice ride stations. And when asked about this, the response from a number of managers was, we like to support this type of activity. It's consistent with the image that our business wants to present. We believe in vitality in the neighborhood. And so by supporting this, we're helping create the neighborhood feel that we want. And you know, we may not be able to look at specific differences in our own profit margins in a particular way, but what we do see is we want to support this because we think it's good for the neighborhood and our business long term. The reasons that businesses work with Nice Ride varied by nature of the business. Cross-promotion is an important part of many of the people that our team spoke with. They felt they want a reputation as a green business, and this is consistent with other activities they may undertake within their enterprises to support sustainability. For those that chose to advertise on kiosks, they saw this as a good way to market to an important demographic that they want to serve. And there were others, for example, bike shops. A couple bike shop owners initially were concerned that bike share might be a substitute for people acquiring a bike. And over time, they mentioned that they were near a bike station. They began to realize that it's actually a complementary activity, and they're more likely to get bike business from someone who tried a bike share ride and then made the grade up to ride their own. So overall, there are a number of different reasons that bike share, that the business owners were supportive of the bike share program, but there were still limitations. They were not, they hadn't moved into providing subscriptions for employee use. Other findings from the interviews: the support for Nice Ride was not unlimited. We saw that food-related businesses were more interested than others, and so when we looked at those results that were stratified, people who ran cafes, bars, restaurants were more supportive general than those who had other types of retail operations. In particular, very few of the business owners or managers wanted to give a parking space in front of their own stations for Nice Ride, though they said they wanted those stations nearby in the line of sight. They were also reluctant to give up sidewalk space. They wanted to make sidewalk space either for an extension of a business or for free-flowing activity. So this was an area that we noticed, among others, where support was tempered. So those were findings from the conversations, the interviews, the in-depth qualitative interviews with about 29 business owners. Overall, the support was positive, though people were hesitant about specific improvements in the infrastructure that they felt might adversely affect their work. The last dimension of the survey was a survey of NiceRide subscribers to obtain information about their use and their expenditures during NiceRide trips. There were, at that point in time, NiceRide Minnesota had not quite 3,700 monthly and annual subscribers. We constructed a survey that was modeled on travel behavior inventories. We asked about trip service, the frequency of NiceRide use. It's useful because you can compare that. We also looked at alternative. We asked people about what would they have done if they had not taken NiceRide. About 30% of the population of NiceRide subscribers responded, so we had about 1,200 surveys that we analyzed. One of the cautions that Sean mentioned earlier in his work about evaluation methodologies of the potential for self-selection, there's likely some of that here. This is the characteristics of the NiceRide subscribers. They're middle-aged, relatively well-educated, higher income individuals, at least in the Minneapolis NiceRide subscribers. The mean age was about 40, household size a little over 2, 20% of the households had children, 85% of the people owned college degrees, and half of those graduate degrees. More than half the income households had relatively high incomes, and what you can see is they have more bikes per household than vehicles. And so what you see is that notion that bike share use is a complementary to people's own bicycle riding. General responses, 59% of the people said they ride their NiceRide weekly. The plurality went 2 to 3 times per week. Half reported using NiceRide for commuting, which underscores an important economic use of a bike share. And a third said they traveled to grocery stores, restaurants, cafes, or bars. If you ask people about how they might have gotten to a destination had they not used NiceRide, they likely would have driven, or they may not have taken the trip at all. When we ask people about their expenditures, the mean expenditure, depending on how we calculate trip frequency, and there's some complexities associated with that, is $7 to $14 per trip, and that's including those people who spent nothing. So the amount of expenditures are modest, but they add up total, and you can see that people are, consistent with that conceptual model that we presented. People are using a NiceRide to access different types of retail store and operations, and they're making expenditures. Again, they're modest. So when we think about these 3 dimensions of the work, and we said our bike share station is generating local economic activity, the station area model suggests yes, we see activity correlated with the presence of other types of businesses. Business perceptions of NiceRide, they believe it's generating some activity. They're pleased to support because they think it's good for business overall. And we see, yes, that NiceRide users are making expenditures. Now we note that it's a limited geographic area, so this is probably moving money around within the city. Some of that have been spent otherwise, so there may be winners and losers, but we see this idea that the infrastructure improvements are resulting in changes in increasing accessibility, making changes in travel behavior decisions that result in changes in expenditure patterns. If we think that the work has a number of implications in terms of how NiceRide and other bike share operations might manage, they can think about how these results inform sponsorship or business partnerships. The model potentially could be used to locate new facilities, to maximize routes. We can think about the preferences and needs of bike share users. There's much more that can be done with the data in terms of looking at types of expenditures by by specific trip purpose. And I think one last thing is the bike share, like many improvements, aren't an economic panacea in themselves, but they have a number of synergistic effects that we think really add to the vitality of a community that are important as we try to maintain healthy, livable communities. So we thank people that supported us, and I'll end here.
All right, thank you, Greg, Erica, and Sean. Now we have some time for questions. If you have not done so already, please go ahead and enter your question in the question box, and we'll start going through questions. All right, my first question goes to Erica. Are you counting money paid to construction workers as a benefit or a cost?
That's a good question, and I think that's one of those things that people honestly in different studies count differently. We mentioned it in terms of a direct impact. You're right that it is a cost, but there have been some studies. I believe there's a study in Baltimore looking at basically the number of jobs created through these construction projects as also a positive. I think that's really, this goes back to the question of what it is that you are trying to measure in your study. Yeah.
All right. As a follow-up, this is also for Erica. The Toronto study you mentioned, is that the Bloor Street study?
I believe it is, yes.
All right, thank you. This next question is for Sean. What was the basis for the buffer distance for the plaza-type improvements?
We were trying to think, we were looking at Madison Square specifically when we started coming up with the buffer, and we were looking at the businesses that were included in the zone that we thought might be immediately impacted. And basically 250 to 350 feet is about a half a block between, it's like a half an avenue block. So any business within a half a block of the improvement site gets swept up in that 250 to 350 foot range.
All right, thank you. My next question. Both New York City and Minneapolis are large cities. What advice can you provide to apply some of your findings to smaller cities?
Well, I think it depends on the availability of data sources and determining what works best for you and what's available. We happen to have this source of data, which I think is most likely available to each city, since it came to us from the state, and every business is required to report some form of this data. So I think it is applicable because we did, even though it's a large city, the sites that we chose are very specific to neighborhoods and neighborhood scale improvements, which any city could have.
This is Greg, and we've, since this study, Jesse Schoner, another colleague, David Levinson, and I have completed another project for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, which has been one of the supporters of Nice Ride. And Nice Ride this past summer did the first step in an expansion to Bemidji, Minnesota. Bemidji's a small community of about 14,000 people. It's a resort community. The downtown borders on a lake. It's a 16-mile bike trail around the lake. And there's a small there's a small state college there, Bemidji State University. And they put in a bike share station with 3 or 4 different sort of points. It's the business model differs. But I think that the approach here and some of the findings are consistent with what we found in a in a quick assessment after the MIGI's first year of operation. The first is that people who use the system are using it to go different places, and some of those include patronage of cafes and businesses. So that finding's consistent. The fact that in this case a minority of riders make expenditures during their ride that was associated with a recreational or other type of social trip, entertainment trip, that's the case as well. And I think the conclusion that there's no particular, they aren't a panacea for, in and of themselves for a neighborhood is also the case. Now, the last thing is, I think that when you think about the business owners' just reasons for participating here, they felt that supportive bike share, sponsorship of a kiosk was consistent with their overall business strategy, and in creating a vital, vibrant, pedestrian-oriented neighborhood. I think that holds true in small communities as well. And so I think that some of the implications are that you need to work with the individual business owners, be able to talk with them and say, we think this will help. It's not going to make or break your business, but we think it's good for business. These types of things, I think, are relevant in smaller sized communities as they begin to experiment with something like bike share.
This is Erica. I would also
recommend.
Erica, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to point out that the third case study that we focused on in our report was the state of Vermont, which is, and they ended up looking at a larger scale, at the statewide scale, and a lot of the economic impacts that they were looking at were much more for the recreational cycling and hiking and running industries, but they may be a place to look for more insights on how to look at much more rural regions in terms of these economic impacts.
All right, thank you very much. Some states do not have sales tax. How would you go about showing quantitative benefits of sustainable streets in places where there are no sales taxes?
That's a good question. I think we did outline several different types of data that we looked into beyond just the sales tax, and some of them for us didn't work out, and a lot of that again is outlined in the report. For us, we chose not to use it because we had the readily available sales tax, but some of the other metrics might be more available in those communities. Rents, if we had access to the rent data in a usable way, I think that would have been really helpful. Asking rents in a neighborhood around a improvement site, assess property values, property sales, things like that might be more readily available in those instances. Plus, of course, there's the qualitative data that could be sort of honed into a very usable piece of information.
All right, thank you. The next question, how have the non-motorized investments and the mode shift to pedestrian and bicycle amenities impacted public transit ridership and public transit amenities or stations?
That's a good question. That is something that we in the 2014 final report for the NTPP project that we highlighted as a topic for future research, that really, especially since some of the pedestrian and bike infrastructure that was funded was really focusing on improving connections to transit, to actually, that a next step should be to try to understand how that impacted the transit service. And we weren't able to do that as part of the NTPP project, but that is definitely an excellent question.
In an unrelated study for the Metropolitan Council here in the Twin Cities, teams of researchers just looked at changes in travel behavior between 2000 and 2010, analyzing 2 travel behavior inventories. And what we found was biking and walking has increased significantly over that decade. When we look at Minneapolis, it's where the majority of the improvements for the non-motorized transportation program were. We see a larger increase. For example, biking rates are much higher in Minneapolis than St. Paul. We've done a bit of modeling, and what we're able to indicate is in 2000, the presence of a bike lane on a street was positively associated with the probability that a person would make a bike trip. That's not the case in 2010. Our hypothesis is that the distribution of bike lanes has become so prevalent now, partly to the investment, that's not important. We ran most recently another model where one of the variables was in whether or not the likelihood of taking a bike trip was influenced by the proximity to a bike share station. We found no significant effect in that case. At the same time, transit level ridership is up in the cities overall. So we saw here in the last decade a growth in both in biking and walking and transit.
All right, thanks, Greg. I want to follow up on that thought a minute with another question. How much does existing bike infrastructure, such as bike lanes, paths, shares, have to do with the economic impact of bike share systems? Would cities be better off building the paths first or implementing bike shares first? Which would have the bigger economic impact?
I don't know off the top of my head the best answer to that question. I think that they're complementary systems. To the extent that you can establish a bike share system and people will begin to use it, you'll have those localized effects, and they'll be distributed across the network. And as you add stations, you'll change some of those effects. I think, to the extent that they attract, for example, one of the largest group of users in Minneapolis is near our visitors to the city, near the convention center. And so that type of use, I think, generates significant new activity in terms of giving people more choices that influence their behavior than other types of activities. I think that my gut tells me that because those types of investments give visitors to the city an option they wouldn't have, they can add new dimensions of travel that way relatively quickly compared to some of the other things that look at long-term change. But again, we've not studied that specifically.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Erica, the next question is for you. Of the 5 economic benefits of non-motor transit that you listed, do the direct benefits have the greatest impact, and which others create large impacts?
I have to say I'm not sure the answer to that question. We were really thinking, we didn't quantify those in this case, and I think you would need to actually, look at different projects to try to quantify that, and it may be different from project to project. We were more trying to split out conceptually what these different types of impacts are than quantifying them for this report.
Okay. All right. The next question is, in many parts of this country, we have a lot of small jurisdictions that are tightly packed together, counties, towns, cities that are just all very jointly connected. How do you suggest we build the argument across these jurisdictions as they already benefit from auto traffic crossing into and out of their business districts?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the end of that question.
So the question is how do you get all these communities to work together and to agree to build these non-motorized programs when they're already benefiting or already have substantial auto traffic crossing in and out of their business districts?
Mm-hmm. So, and I think part of it is looking at some of these studies that have been put out there and looking at, looking at what the difference that having a streetscape that is pedestrian and bicycle friendly and accessible can mean, that can bring another type of visitor, and that can bring a type of visitor who may spend money in different ways. I think that can help to create that argument. And I think the other thing in terms of thinking about cities and different jurisdictions working together is that is something that the NTPP, especially the counties that were involved, Marin County and Sheboygan County, really had to deal with in planning how they were going to spend the money that they had and how to create, not just within the city but within the county, create consensus about project priorities. And that is also something that we cover in the 2012 report to Congress, and then also the 2014 final report is some summary of how they structured those planning processes and created the project selection criteria to structure those decisions.
James, here in
Okay.
Minneapolis.
Oh, go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
The Metropolitan Council tackled that problem within the last year and a half. They retained a consultant to work on a regional bikeways plan. MnDOT, the state, is now involved in the statewide bike system plan. And what they've done is I think, they've tried to illustrate, as Erica just suggested, the importance of some success stories where the types of things that Sean presented, where investments in bike infrastructure have made an important difference locally. And then they've looked at the role that regional connections can play to connecting the suburban downtowns or the ex-urban downtowns to other places with either regional designated bikeways or Class 1 multi-use trails. And I think that it's a challenging process, but I think the Metropolitan Council has done a good job in terms of letting people know in each of the counties and each of the municipalities that the project was underway, and talking with them about what's the relative priority for these broader connections that will, in a sense, provide support and provide synergistic effects for the investments they're making locally. So you look at trying to leverage each other's investments, I think, is a good strategy.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question. A reminder, the presentation slides and recording of the webinar will be posted online to pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. I hope to have that up by the end of the week. Also check our Facebook page, facebook.com/pedbike, for updates. I want to let you know there will be a brief survey that will appear once the webinar is ended. We'd love to get your feedback on our performance today. And finally, I'd like to thank our speakers, Erica Simmons, Sean Quinn, and Greg Lindsay. And thank you to all of you for attending today's CBIC webinar. Hope everyone has a nice afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.